Now, this might surprise you. The people of Nigeria, Tanzania, and South Africa have a better quality of life than Americans, Germans, Swedes, and Brits. They are, in short, flourishing. And to explain what flourishing actually means is Dr. Victor Counted, who's Associate Professor of Psychology at Regent University in Virginia. And we're also joined by Patrick and Donu. First of all, Victor, thank you very much indeed for joining us and talking to us about this unusual study. Tell us, what is flourishing exactly?
First of all, I want to say thank you for having me, Matt and Patrick and Donna. It's really an honor to kind of join you all here. In our work, we try to kind of talk about well-being or flourishing ultimately as a state in which all aspect of a person's life is good in relation to their environment or the place they find themselves or their context. And so that is the initial conversational idea of how we kind of talk about flourishing broadly. But over the past centuries, we've had a lot of people kind of talk about flourishing, whether it's philosophers, or even scientists from different cultures. They've kind of tried to kind of give an idea as to what flourishing might mean. And each tradition, I think, they sort of take a different take in terms of what it is. But I think the good life, the idea of the good life, it's really what they point to. But what we know for sure is that it's not one particular thing. It's sort of multidimensional. There are aspects of the good life that might work for one, but also they might not work for others as well. And that's what we've tried to do in our work, to sort of take that multidimensional angle, right? To identify what flourishing is. But most importantly, though, is the fact that it's not linear, right? It's sort of a complex process that involves multi-layered processes, really.
So it's about a lot more than GDP per capita, for instance.
Of course, especially for non-developing contexts or non-Western contexts where ideas of flourishing might not lean well towards, what we understand as development, especially in a Western context. In places like Africa, the way flourishing is understood there might be different. And how the question then is, how do we tap into those African sensibilities and frameworks, right? Knowledge frameworks to really unpack what flourishing might mean for a particular context. But also, I think there are two ways to study anything, really. One is to take a cross-cultural approach, which in social science we call that ethic. Taking an ethic approach, meaning to take a universal lens to look at something, right? And taking a universal lens, the implication of that is that there are ways that you can compare. You can compare what something is based on a particular way of looking at it. For example, when we say flourishing is a state in which all aspect of one's life is good, and that involves things that are ends in themselves, things that are universally desired, things like health, things like happiness, things like meaning, things like character for most people. If that is the definition of happiness or even social relationship, what does that mean across cultures? How can we use this ethic lens to look at it? But the other way to talk about it is to take an emic approach, really, to ask a question from this particular context. How can we understand flourishing ultimately?
What is it then that Nigerians have, for instance, that puts them above Americans in terms of the flourishing metric?
It might be that some countries that we think that might not be doing well in a way that we conceptualize what good life is, which normally streams from a Western lens, they might actually be doing well, you know. And then it backs and us to ask the question, what does a good life ultimately mean for those people in this context? Because I think in Africa, flourishing would mean living with dignity and meaning, right? Especially where there is some kind of cycle of disruptions of poverty and different things all happening. How do people flourish in spite of that? And I think that is really the holy grail of African development, because if we can untap that, do research that can scale that and make us understand it and implement policies that support those sensibilities, ultimately, I think, the continent will be in a much better shape, hopefully.
Patrick?
I wondered how your index, your research fits into other measures. There's this global happiness index, which a lot of people have punted. And that seems to be all over the place. It seems some countries in Africa rate very highly on that, and some countries, don't. And then maybe it's part of this other attempt globally to look at new measures of even GDP, saying that actually GDP, just in terms of the number of transactions that sort of make up the GDP, is not relevant. We should be looking at other measures, even of just a purely economic well-being.
The global flourishing study in itself, so what we did in that study is to look at what flourishing might mean across 22 countries. Most importantly, how we did that was to draw from all these different constructs related to flourishing while at the same time using our flourishing index. But when you think about how well-being or flourishing has been assessed across different contexts, there are tons of measures that are out there. There's the subjective well-being measure. There's the psychological well-being. There's even the PAMA model as well. You know, but one of the things that we did that I think is very unique is that we extracted the strengths in all these measures in our work to really capture what flourishing might mean at 6 main domains. One, it's happiness and life satisfaction. The second is physical and mental health. The third is character and virtue. The fourth is meaning and purpose, close social relationships, and financial and material well-being. Now, the financial indicators, sometimes we have to remove that in some case just to compare what happens when we remove that. There's a bit of complexity in terms of the measurement, but so far, I think the flourishing measure that we use results is showing that it's really very robust.
Is it true to say you're kind of really the economic wealth that is so important to people in the West is just one of 6 indicators
Yes.
for you? So you're really putting a lot more weight on spirituality, relationships with other people, feeling meaning and purpose in your life, which is kind of refreshing given the rampant materialism in the West at the moment.
I don't find it refreshing at all. I think it's patronizing. Because, of course, white people never concentrate on the better things about life. And all black people are kumbaya, my lord. Come on. I find the whole thing so patronizing. First thing I noticed was there wasn't a huge amount of difference between Indonesia at the top of the chart and Japan at the bottom, with countries like the United States sort of like hovering somewhere in the middle, right? So what that tells me, tell me if I'm wrong, is that all human beings value these emotional, spiritual, connectedness related benefits. Because really, according to this theory, America should be like 1, and the poorest African country where everyone holds hands around the campfire every night should be 100, But what we have is a situation where most countries fit within quite a narrow margin. So there's not a whole load of difference between what your average American wants and what your average Indonesian or Nigerian wants.
Yeah, that's a fair point, really. But also, I want to say, in terms of not necessarily that we're measuring spirituality per se, but also spirituality is actually a character strength in psychology, right? The idea of transcendence, and research actually support that. Just merely just people having some kind of spiritual connection actually helps to support their well-being, right? And there is consistent research in that space. On the other hand, I think what is missing broadly in the conversation on well-being is the piece on character and virtue, and which I think it's very novel about our work that we have to factor those things in. That what are the character strengths that a particular people might have might actually help sustain their sense of flourishing or well-being. But the bigger question is, I think I also acknowledge the concern that you have about the fact that people are, so to say, extrinsically religious doesn't necessarily mean that they are doing well. It's not necessarily extrinsic religiosity, but intrinsic religiosity, whereby people are connected to something greater than them, whatever that might mean, whether it's to God, whether it's to Allah, whether it's to your local gym, that you see that there's a sense of sacredness in that experience, might actually have something, might be supporting your well-being in some sense. But generally, most research kind of support that. Of course, there are other negative effects as well that can be ignored. But I do think the greater thing there is the fact that there are limits to taking Western metrics because they miss things like the community dimension, which, especially when we think about flourishing in Africa, I would say that it's sort of a nested cycle where it starts from the community and then it goes into the family and then the individual, which then energizes the civic responsibility or participation of the individual, and then it goes back to the community. Whereas when you take the Western framework, which is often individualistic in a sense, it starts with the individual and sometimes it stops there.
But Victor, are you actually, disassociating developmental well-being and financial well-being from all these other things? Your index includes financial well-being as part of it, right?
When I talk about human flourishing, when I say that it's not a linear thing, oftentimes when people think about human flourishing, they think about it having, these are things that leads to flourishing. Once you do this, you automatically, have a flourishing life. But it's not like that. I believe that in my work, most of my work and publications have kind of shown this in different ways. Flourishing involves four particular mechanisms. In fact, it involves four stages. One is the mechanisms of flourishing. The second is the disruptors of flourishing. The third is our adaptive responses. And then last part of that is our outcomes of flourishing. And sometimes we focus on the outcomes. And like the sixth dimension that I mentioned, for example, happiness, life satisfaction, meaning and purpose, mental and physical, all that are all the outcomes of a flourishing life. Now, when we talk about the mechanisms, I'm talking about the psychosocial mechanism or the social mechanisms, whether it's the community dynamics, the family systems, the relationship that one is a part of, the sense of belonging that one has. All these are all psychosocial processes that shape a flourishing life. But then you have the psychospiritual processes. These are like things like a sense of connection to God that people have, certain mystical experiences that they have that ultimately might help them. Things like hope, having a sense of hope is also a psychospiritual experience that when people experience that, it sustains their flourishing. But at the disruptive level, even though you might have a sense of hope, even though you might have genuinely at a functional level, want to have a connection to the sacred, which research shows supports well-being.
So what you're saying is that prayer helps.
Exactly. And we see that today.
I'm still struggling to understand how somebody in Malawi, for instance, can feel that they are flourishing when they can't afford to buy the next meal, or they're very worried. They're financially or materially very insecure. How can that person, despite all of the wealth of spiritual and community connection, how can that person feel that their life is flourishing when they have the very basic pedestrian necessities that are lacking in their life?
That's a good question. Now, I think that also lands to what I talk about as the disruptors of African flourishing. Because when we think about what disrupts flourishing in Africa, I think it's important that we are honest about that. The challenge, I think, is it's not only poverty or lack of resources. There are real disruptors that actually run deeper than we can think of. They can be historical disruptors. They can be cultural. In fact, one example could be colonial legacies, for example, because many of the systems that uh, we live today, we're not designed for flourishing. Ultimately, they're sort of designed for control and extraction. And so, whether it's colonial governments or centralized powers that replaced indigenous councils and knowledge systems, they replaced that with rigid hierarchies, and that in itself has and added a bit of, especially in African context now, one of the things we see more than ever, it's a focus on, capitalism, right? Which is great, in the West, but would it be in African context? And especially for most African countries after independence, they inherited the structures, and so now we find that most of their leaders now want to control resources at the top. It's not brought down at the community level, as it is in most of the systems. The other thing also, the other thing that we should remember is the idea of, I call it imported individualism. I think that's another disruptor. And because individualistic tendencies are not necessarily African in nature. We accumulate wealth. The wealth is no longer for the community because there's an imported Western framework that actually we inherited due to the colonialistic legacies. And when this model of individualistic tendencies or individualism itself takes root, success then becomes, how much can I achieve for myself? And so you see this even among young African professionals who kind of aspire to leave their communities to make something for themselves. You see this in politics, right? The other thing also that I think is another disruptor, which might stem from the 2 points that I mentioned, is corruption and idea of self-aggrandizement in African politics. Because when colonial structures meet individualistic tendencies or thinking, you find corruption kind of takes shape because it's not in the fabric of the people to think about the self, that it's about me, right? And when community resources that are meant for schools or hospitals are sort of siphoned into private accounts and lavish lifestyle, you see that over and over as, I think, the after effect of, I would argue it's an after effect of some of those legacies that we inherited.
So you know something? Harold Wilson, the late British Prime Minister, said that one of the things that held the working class people, that is, at that time he was mostly talking about white people, was poverty of expectation. And I really have problems with people, applauding poverty of expectation. People who don't know any better and are willing to settle for almost nothing. I believe in stimulating ambition and individualism, if that is what it takes. I'm not saying we shouldn't have community values or that it shouldn't take a village to raise a child or whatever. I'm just saying that I don't think it's good for Africans to be told that where they're at is a good place, because it's not. And I think we should encourage individualism, we should encourage ambition, we should encourage dynamism, the sense of autonomy and self-sufficiency, So I'm not saying there shouldn't be caring and sharing. I'm just saying don't encourage them to be happy as they are.
I'm not saying that everything about the Western framework is bad. No, that's not what I'm saying. But everything about Western individualistic mindset, is it good for Africa? I would argue maybe not. But I think a good way to talk about this or look at this is to talk about, okay, what are the things perhaps that Africans might have inherited that are actually disruptive for us, in terms of that disrupts what it means to live a good life from an African epistemology. And when we talk about adaptive responses, what are the positive things about maybe other cultures that we could draw from to enhance what we're doing?
I'm really keen to find out if there are any regional differences, because of the 22 countries that have been surveyed, and we've got 5 African countries that have come out tops. They've beaten US, Germany, Sweden, etc. We've got Nigeria, we've got Kenya, we've got Egypt, we've got Tanzania and South Africa. Now, in Southern Africa, Obviously, there is the indigenous philosophy of Ubuntu. What is it about in Egyptian life, for instance, that sets it apart, that makes it a more of a flourishing community than, say, Sweden?
It goes back to the context of the people and how they kind of, I guess, live their life. Like one of the things we found was, um, you know, for example, countries like Nigeria, like you mentioned, there were emphases on social relationships. Countries in, let's say, Eastern Africa, like Rwanda or even Ethiopia, for example, with Eastern African countries where there was strong emphasis on social well-being indicators, right? Feeling respected, learning new things daily, even when economic indicators were low in those contexts. But in Western African contexts, we found that they scored high in sort of emotional well-being, with people, laughing more than other regions, or, having positive emotions. In South African nations, for example, in spite of the income inequality, they actually showed strong resilience in their community ties and cultural practices that might be rooted in things like Ubuntu. Now, in Northern African countries, we did touch on some of the countries. I wouldn't say we saw much there because we didn't really collect enough data to make assumptions, but we know that they rank highest in life evaluations. And part of that could be, one could argue that they might have better institutions, or, structures or healthcare systems to support, the satisfaction of one's life in those contexts. Whereas countries in other regions were, scored a bit lower.
Could I ask you, what is your time frame for this? Are you going to be measuring this over a period of years? How far do you go back? Because there just seems to be, I'm pretty optimistic about things, but I have to say there does seem to be a global sense of foreboding in the world today. We have more wars going on in the world than ever, whether in Africa, sad to say, but also obviously in Ukraine and in the Middle East. We seem to be in a period where people are getting pretty gloomy about the world in general. And I wondered how you think that is going to affect your flourishing index.
Yeah, that's a good question. I do think, of course, the plan is to, like any good research or work, it's not something that's a timeline to it, right? We'll kind of keep learning as we enrich our framework. But also the other thing I want to say is, I know that there's a lot of things going on in the world, but really there's nothing new in the world. We've always had, violence and conflicts,
Absolutely.
in almost every decade, like you could, and it makes sense. Of course, we're living in a very interesting time, and there's a tendency to forget that this always been how the world is, sadly, right? But underneath that tendency, that unmooring tendency, it's strengths that keep us grounded in spite of what's happening, and that's where the adaptive responses could come from. And so the reason why I talk about this, oftentimes, even with a global flourishing study, we focus on the outcomes, right? We forget, okay, we focus on the outcomes. Sometimes we talk about the mechanisms, but the in-between factors or processes are more important than the outcomes and how it starts. Because the fact that you know how to pray, the fact that you're hopeful, the fact that you have a sense of belonging, the fact that you have good relationships, mechanisms that show flourishing, doesn't necessarily mean that it will lead its way to you having flourishing ultimately.
Generally speaking, I think your assessment of various African countries is a more positive. It provides a more positive narrative than we are used to. How can that benefit these countries? How would you like that data and that more positive perception to be used?
I wouldn't necessarily say we took a jet positive approach, because then that becomes as a bias that informs the research, but that's not the case. But because if it lands towards a negative lens, we can see that in the data, depending on which country scores higher and what is scored lower in. And we look at those indicators to see where the weaknesses are for the countries. But I think there are perhaps 3 or 4 things that we should focus on: community conditions, family functioning, and individual capability. Now, civic participation and engagement is also another part of that. But these four things, I think, are very important to understand flourishing in Africa. I believe that there are really mechanisms that really drive that. Now, what could be the positive adaptation responses or positive adaptation strategies in all these spaces? Now, we could think about the negative adaptation, for example, at the community condition, corruption, right? Lack of safety. Leadership becomes more for control, not stewardship. But at the positive level of that, perhaps trust, building trust through some kind of what is political transparency, right? Safety also becomes a part of that, and also even building traditions that support the knowledge systems of Africa that really reminds people that serving community, it's really at the core of the African identity. In some cultures in Africa, there are ways that families come together to support one another, right? And even respect, it's sometimes passed down across generation. And you see that very visible and tangible. I'm not saying that it's perfect, but there's something about those strategies or adaptive tendencies that could help strengthen family networks, right, across the culture. And that in itself could help to actually reduce, I think, conflict and violence and misunderstanding in the continent.
I'm surprised that you have not mentioned something that an area in which Africans have a clear advantage over the Western world people, which is the treatment of the elderly.
Mm.
I have lived of course, in both countries as a young person and as an older person. And I can tell you that the African attitude towards older people, that it is clearly superior. Young people are much more respectful and much more willing to pick up wisdom from the old elders, even when the elders have no wisdom. There is that respect. And then there's also a willingness to be practically supportive. Honestly, I cannot set foot anywhere in Nigeria, be it a supermarket or an airport or whatever, without some young person rushing over to help me with my bag. You know what I mean? Because I'm clearly struggling, you know?
Yeah. Yeah.
That does
Yeah.
not happen in London or Spain or France. So I think, there are ways in which quality of life does not, as you say, revolve around GDP. There are ways in which there's there are clear advantages to being African rather than European. Sometimes I see old people in London and I feel sorry for them, old Black people. They're basically on their own unless their children are looking after them.
I can relate well with what you're saying, actually. But also that is part of the family functioning, right? Adaptive responses, and one could be the way we treat our elderly, which, when comes to policy and implementation, comes down to aged care, right? Especially for the elderly, and providing services that support the elderly, and even in Africa and even most non-Western cultures actually have systems like that, where either the grandparents lives with the family, and it's not seen as something bad per se, right? In fact, the greatest challenge facing most of the African diaspora right now is that a lot of Africans in the diaspora are aging, right? And I say that because I'm also Australian citizen as well, and so I lived in Australia for a while before I moved to the U.S. And I see that an aging African population in Australia, right? And the question is, what do you do about that when the kids have already adopted, an individualistic, tendency because they were born in the West, they were born in Sydney, they were born in the UK.
Okay, can I bring you back finally, Vic? Can I bring you back to how you would like this type of information, this data that you're accruing, how would you like that to be used?
Thank you for that question. I think, of course, when we talk about flourishing in general, there's a tendency to always focus on the outcomes of flourishing and to compare, oh, this country is doing well, this country is not. And, there are countries falling through the cracks and all, which is understandable. But the bigger question is why, right? And Africa has both realities. In some contexts, we know that this disruption of flourishing has pulled many communities into a vicious cycle of mistrust and violence and corruption and nepotism. The main thing, I think, African institutions should stand behind this kind of movement or this idea or vision of a flourishing African future. And because of the reason why that's important, it's also because research is showing over and over that the current metrics of development that we're using, it's not really compatible with the African sensibilities. It's not compatible with the African context. How can we build something that really might work for us, or rather support what really is flourishing for us? And how can we scale that and strengthen that so that, it can impact the African communities and Africans, regardless of where they find themselves.
We chatted to Dr. Counted on September the 12th. I'll put more details about his research in the show notes. Now, remember to like, subscribe, and share. You can also get us on major audio platforms. www.AfricaHere&NOW.com is our website. You can catch up with all our past episodes there. Our original music is by Emmerich Adam, and Busby and Simon Elliott produce and edit the show. Our thanks to Dr. Victor Counted, and our thanks to you, as ever, for your company.